On my 70th birthday, while candles still burned and guests waited for a speech, my daughter handed me a white envelope. Inside wasn't love, wasn't gratitude, it was a bill. Every diaper, every school fee, every bite of food I had ever given her, reduced to cold numbers. The room froze, shame tightened my chest, and yet I signed it without a word. Because what she didn't know was that I had already written the one document that mattered most, my real will. I had imagined my 70th birthday as a gentle checkpoint on a long and winding road. One marked with soft laughter, tender smiles, and a fragile gratitude that I had lasted this long. I woke that morning with the strange weight of time pressing down on me. Not as a burden, but as a reminder. My bones ached in the predictable way, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror carried the lines of decades. Yet beneath all of that was a flicker of hope, hope that my daughter would stand beside me. Not as an adversary, but as family. The house buzzed with the kind of energy that belongs to milestones. Neighbors filled the living room with chatter. Cousins I hadn't seen in years shook my hand with rehearsed enthusiasm. And someone fiddled with the stereo until a crackling Sinatra record filled the air. The scent of roasted chicken and frosted cake drifted into every corner. From the outside, it was perfect. From the inside, I felt a crack forming. When Emily entered, she carried not just herself, but a carefully curated poise. The way someone carries a secret too heavy to hide. She greeted guests with polite warmth, but her eyes avoided mine. I recognized the distance in them. It was the same distance I had felt growing over the years. A wall made brick by brick from unspoken resentments and unmet expectations. I told myself I would not ruin the evening by reading too much into her silence. The moment came after the candles. 70 flames burned before me. Each one a memory I could not hold. Guests clapped, urging me to blow them out. I inhaled deeply, released, and the flames surrendered in a breath. Applause followed, then cheers, then a subtle hush. That was when Emily stepped forward. She didn't hug me. She didn't even smile. Instead, she placed a white envelope on the table in front of me. The room tilted into silence. I opened it, expecting perhaps a letter, a photograph, or a note of affection. What I found instead was cold, typewritten lines. Each one was a record of my supposed debts: diapers, formula, pediatric visits, piano lessons, high school trips, college tuition, utilities during her teenage years. At the bottom, the total formed a number that felt both absurd and cruel. 6 figures staring back at me like an accusation. Gasps echoed across the room. Someone muttered that it had to be a joke. But Emily's face told me otherwise. She explained, calmly, that this was her way of balancing the books, of acknowledging that childhood came with a price, and that debts, no matter how old, must eventually be paid. Her voice cut through me with a precision sharper than any blade. I felt heat rise in my chest. The sting of humiliation. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or condemn. My first instinct was to shout, to demand how she could reduce decades of sacrifice into an invoice. Yet, I resisted. I placed the envelope back on the table, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. I picked up a pen, signed my name across the bottom, and returned it to her. The room erupted in whispers. Some called me foolish, others pitied me, and still others looked at Emily with open disgust. She seemed satisfied, even triumphant. But deep inside, I knew something she didn't. The stage was set, and her invoice, as cruel as it was, had only secured her role in the story I had been preparing to tell. That night, beneath the flickering glow of birthday candles, I let her believe she had won. After the party began to blur into fragmented conversations and the clinking of glasses, I retreated inward. My body was still in that room, But my mind wandered back decades, retracing the long road I had walked with Emily by my side. I remembered the first night after her mother died. When Emily was only 5. She had clung to me like a lifeline, her tears soaking through my shirt. I had whispered reassurances, though I wasn't sure I believed them myself. From that night onward, I became both mother and father, breadwinner and nurturer. I worked 2 jobs, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark. My body exhausted but my resolve unshaken. Every extra shift, every meal skipped, every worn pair of shoes was a quiet declaration: my daughter will not be without. There were the school projects I stayed up late helping with, my clumsy hands gluing cardboard and cutting construction paper under dim lamplight. There were the endless bills, each one a reminder of how fragile survival could be. And there were the moments of pride too, the first time she played piano at a recital. The way her small voice trembled but carried through the hall. I clapped harder than anyone, because I knew the cost of that moment. Yet, somewhere along the way, the closeness fractured. Perhaps it was in high school, when she began pulling away, surrounding herself with friends and ambitions that left me as an afterthought. Perhaps it was in college, when she rarely called except to ask for money. Or perhaps it was simply the cruel truth of time, that love can be taken for granted until it feels invisible. Now, holding that envelope in my mind, I realized Emily had rewritten our history. Where I saw sacrifice, she saw obligation. Where I felt love, she saw debt. The gap between us was not just years, it was an entirely different language of memory. I stood quietly in the corner, watching her laugh with distant cousins, as if nothing had just happened. To the crowd, I was the pitiful father shamed on his birthday. To myself, I was a man gathering strength. Every cruel line on that invoice became fuel. It reminded me that my life's work had not been wasted, it had only been misplaced in her eyes. And as I replayed each memory, a resolve hardened inside me. I would not let her define my legacy. The party did not recover from that moment. Conversations carried on, but they carried an edge. The kind of sharpness that comes when people don't know where to place their judgment. I heard snippets as I moved among them. Some whispered that Emily was ungrateful, a daughter who had forgotten the hand that raised her. Others suggested that I had spoiled her, that I had failed to teach her respect, that perhaps the invoice was a distorted cry for attention. Each word stung, not because I agreed with them, but because I saw how easily people assign blame. My life, my daughter, my choices, they had all become public property, dissected in hushed tones over wine glasses and cake plates. I caught sight of a neighbor shaking his head, muttering that children these days had no sense of duty. Another relative shrugged, saying, perhaps I had brought this humiliation upon myself by refusing to remarry, by pouring too much into a child who could never repay it. Their words reached me like distant echoes, but I refused to let them anchor me in shame. Emily basked in the chaos, her smile faint but noticeable. She seemed to feed off the discomfort in the room, as though every whisper validated her stance. I studied her from across the room, noting how she carried herself with pride, how she truly believed she had the upper hand. But in my silence, I began to craft a different picture. These whispers, this judgment, it was all temporary. What mattered was the story that would outlast the evening. I knew what they did not, that there was a document waiting in my desk drawer upstairs. A document that carried more weight than any invoice she could invent. I let the whispers wash over me, let the humiliation burn into my skin like a brand, because I knew that when the time came, those same voices would shift. They would speak not of my shame, but of my choice, my justice, my final act as a father. And as the party staggered forward, I smiled to myself. They thought the night had reached its climax. They didn't realize it had only just begun. As the hours slipped by, Emily could no longer resist stepping into the center of the stage she had built for herself. The party had become less about my birthday and more about her statement. Her performance. She stood near the cake table. Posture tall. Voice calm but deliberate. As though she were delivering a lecture. I watched her gather attention with the ease of someone who believed entirely in her righteousness. She began by explaining that the invoice was not meant to humiliate, but to create fairness. She spoke of debts, of responsibilities, of how love should never mean losing track of what is owed. She said she had calculated the costs because it was time we all admitted that parenthood, in the end, is a contract. I listened in silence, as did everyone else. The room tightened with unease. Some shifted in their seats, while others tried to mask their disbelief. Inside me, memories pushed against her words like waves against a dam. I remembered rocking her to sleep after nightmares. When no ledger was in sight, I remembered choosing second-hand coats so she could have new books. None of that fit into the arithmetic she proudly displayed. Her justification carried the tone of someone untouchable, as if logic alone could erase the warmth of shared years. She explained that by issuing the invoice, she was reclaiming her independence, that she wanted to stand as someone who owed nothing to anyone, not even to the man who had raised her. The cruelty of that phrasing did not escape me. Around her, whispers rose again, but she carried on, as though each objection only confirmed her strength. I noticed the sharp pride in her eyes, the kind that blinds a person to the cracks in their own reasoning. She believed herself to be powerful, even enlightened. I stood with my hands folded, allowing her stage, because I knew that soon enough she would be forced to reckon, not with my anger but with my truth. Her justification only deepened my resolve. That night, in front of my guests, I let her declare her philosophy, but in the quiet recess of my heart, I declared my own, that love is never a balance sheet. And the final reckoning was mine to deliver. The laughter and clinking glasses resumed, but the celebration no longer belonged to joy. It had turned into a courtroom, and Emily had claimed the role of prosecutor. I, however, was no defendant. I was a man preparing his final testimony. I slipped away from the main room under the guise of fatigue. My footsteps carried me down the familiar hallway to my study, where the scent of old wood and ink wrapped around me like an embrace. I opened the desk drawer with steady hands and drew out the leather-bound folder that had rested there for years. Inside was the document I had revised countless times, my will. Each page held more than instructions. It held the story of my life, written not in words, but in choices. I had originally planned to divide my estate evenly, with Emily as the central heir. But over time, as distance grew and bitterness replaced gratitude, I had adjusted the lines. The more she pulled away, the clearer it became my legacy was not meant to be squandered on entitlement. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a calmness that surprised me. The anger from earlier had cooled into something sharper, a resolve that pulsed with clarity. I thought of the long hours spent building what I now possessed, the house, the savings, the small investments that had blossomed into security. They were not accidents, they were my life's work. To give them blindly to someone who reduced my sacrifices to an invoice would be to betray the very meaning of legacy. I remembered my wife, gone too soon, and the quiet promise I had made at her graveside that our daughter would never feel abandoned. That promise had carried me through decades of struggle, but promises are not chains. Love can be offered, but it cannot be forced, and it cannot survive when it is turned into currency. Closing the folder, I pressed my hand against its cover as though sealing a vow. Tomorrow, or perhaps even tonight, the truth would come out, not in anger, but in clarity. When I returned to the living room, I carried myself differently. Guests may not have noticed, but I knew. My silence was no longer weakness. It was preparation. I re-entered the room as though nothing had happened. Smiles met me, though they were tight and uncertain. I offered small talk to those nearby, asked about grandchildren, complimented a neighbor's suit, even lifted a forkful of cake. Outwardly, I had surrendered to the role of a forgiving father. Inwardly, I was counting the minutes until my stage arrived. Emily floated around the room with a confidence that cut me. She laughed with relatives, her smile flashing like a trophy. To her, the night was already won. She believed the invoice had settled the matter, that she had placed me in my rightful corner. But beneath the surface, I could sense a growing restlessness among the guests. Their whispers had turned to pointed stares, their laughter to strained chuckles. The air was charged, brittle. I let it build. Tension is a kind of currency, and tonight I intended to spend it. As the evening waned and plates emptied, I tapped my glass gently. The sound cut through the noise. Heads turned. Conversations silenced. I told them I had a few words to share before the night ended. Emily raised an eyebrow, amused, expecting perhaps a tired expression of gratitude or a clumsy attempt to mend fences. I stood tall despite my age, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. I began softly, thanking them for coming, for celebrating with me, for sharing 70 long years. My voice wove gratitude with sorrow, laying the groundwork for what was to come. I saw Emily's smirk deepen, convinced of her control. What she didn't know was that the moment she had forced upon me, the public spectacle of the invoice had given me the perfect stage for my own unveiling. And as the room waited for my next words, I let a pause stretch long enough for unease to settle. The calm before the reveal had arrived, and I was ready to rewrite the night. When the clinking of glasses finally quieted and the music faded to a background murmur, I knew the time had come. My body felt heavier than usual. But it wasn't weakness. It was the weight of a decision I had carried for years, the culmination of a father's long journey. I rose slowly, steadying myself against the table. Conversations died away. The hush that filled the room had an almost sacred quality. I spoke of gratitude first, thanking everyone for joining me on such a milestone day. I let them hear the tremble in my voice, the tremor of a man reflecting on 70 long years. Faces softened, some smiled gently, but I kept them waiting, deliberately pacing my words. Tension is a fragile thread, and I had learned in life that holding it too tightly makes it snap. The trick was to let it stretch, taut and unbroken, until no one dared to look away. Then I mentioned my will. The very word shifted the atmosphere. Guests exchanged nervous glances, their whispers cutting like wind through brittle leaves. It was not the kind of announcement anyone expected at a birthday celebration. Yet I leaned into their discomfort, because it gave me power. Emily sat back with a smile curling at the edge of her mouth. She believed this was her final coronation, the moment her father would publicly anoint her as the rightful heir. I could almost hear the pride in her unspoken thoughts. She had no idea. I told them that tonight was not only about marking the years I had lived, but about acknowledging what I would leave behind. The suspense was unbearable, even for me. My palms grew damp, my breath shallow. Yet I pressed forward. For 70 years, I had lived through loss and triumph, through the labor of building something from nothing. Now, I stood ready to decide how that labor would echo beyond me. The room was hushed to the point where I could hear my own heartbeat. Emily leaned forward, expectant, her eyes lit with hunger. In that moment, I realized the brilliance of her invoice. It had forced the curtain open, set the audience in their seats, and handed me the stage. She thought she had written the script, but she was only the prologue. Before revealing the contents of the will, I decided the audience needed context. A will is not just a document, it is a story told in ink. And so I began with the beginning. I spoke of my childhood in a small town, how my parents had taught me the value of hard work and dignity. I described the struggles of building a life with my late wife, How together we created a home not of luxury, but of stability. And then I told them of the darkest night, when death stole her away and left me with a 5-year-old girl who needed more than I thought I could give. I let them hear the truth of those years, how I had worked 2 jobs, often falling asleep at the kitchen table. My body exhausted, but my heart unwilling to quit. I told them about the times I had skipped meals to make sure Emily never went hungry. The times I had patched her shoes so she could walk proudly into school. The nights I had stayed awake, nursing her fevers alone. The crowd grew still. Some lowered their heads. Others dabbed at their eyes. My voice carried both pride and sorrow, weaving sacrifice into memory. I wanted them to see what Emily had forgotten, that raising her was never a burden measured in dollars, but a covenant carved in love. I shifted then. Speaking of the moments of joy, the piano recital, where her fingers trembled but never faltered. The high school graduation, where her smile filled me with pride. The college acceptance letter that felt like a victory for us both. I reminded them that every achievement of hers was also a triumph of mine, born from the sacrifices behind closed doors. And then, deliberately, I contrasted it with the invoice she had handed me. I described how it reduced decades of devotion into cold arithmetic, how it turned tenderness into transactions. My words were careful, not accusatory, but undeniable. The contrast spoke louder than anger ever could. By the time I paused, the guests were transfixed. Emily's expression had shifted, her smile faltered, her eyes restless. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that the story she tried to write over me was not the one people were now hearing. I had not yet revealed the will, but already, the balance of power had begun to turn. When the air was heavy with emotion and no one dared move, I finally unfolded the pages of the will. My hands shook slightly, not from weakness, but from the gravity of the moment. I cleared my throat and began to read. I spoke of small bequests, first the modest sums left to neighbors who had helped me in times of need, to cousins who had stood by me during lonely years. I described gifts of books, heirlooms, and keepsakes, each one chosen with care. Guests listened, their eyes widening as they realized this was no ordinary distribution. Then came the heart of it. I announced that the majority of my estate, my home, my savings, my investments would not go to Emily. Instead, it would be dedicated to a charitable foundation in my late wife's name, a fund to support children who had lost a parent, to ensure they would never feel abandoned the way Emily and I once had. The silence was absolute. I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then came the collective gasp, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls. Emily froze. Her face drained of its triumphant glow. Her mouth parted slightly. But no words came. The room watched her as much as me, their eyes darting between father and daughter. Some guests nodded in approval, their sympathy flooding toward me. Others stared in disbelief, as though they had witnessed something unthinkable. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for her glass, her mask cracking. The arrogance she had worn so proudly was slipping, replaced by something raw: shock, fear, and the first taste of powerlessness. I held the silence, letting the weight of the revelation settle. This was the moment she had not foreseen. Her invoice had been meant to humiliate me, but instead, it had become the catalyst for her own unraveling. And as the room waited for her reaction, I felt a calmness wash over me. The balance had shifted. The night was no longer hers to command. It was mine. The stillness did not last long. Shock gave way to fury. And fury has a way of filling every corner of a room. Emily's composure shattered like glass. She rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, her movements sharp and ungraceful. For the first time that night, she was stripped of the practiced elegance she had worn like armor. Her voice carried not with calm reasoning, but with rage that had been building beneath the surface. She accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of undermining her years of devotion. She spoke of all the errands she had run, the appointments she had accompanied me to, the care she believed she had given in my later years. Her words were soaked in self-righteousness, a desperate attempt to paint herself as the long-suffering caretaker who deserved compensation. I listened, but so did everyone else. And they did not hear devotion. They heard entitlement. Her anger betrayed her. She insisted that every meal she had cooked, every phone call she had answered, every hour she had spent visiting me was a form of labor, deserving of wages. She reduced love, yet again, into transaction. The crowd recoiled, some shaking their heads, others exchanging uneasy glances. Her tirade lasted minutes that felt like hours. The Emily I once cradled, once guided through storms, now stood exposed. She was not the righteous daughter she had pretended to be, but a woman consumed by greed, by a need to validate herself through money rather than love. I felt no joy in watching her unravel, only sorrow. Yet within that sorrow was also a vindication. For years, I had wondered whether my suspicions were wrong, whether perhaps I had misjudged the distance between us. That night, in front of everyone, she confirmed what I had long feared. When her fury exhausted itself, she sat down, trembling. The silence that followed was heavy and condemning. Guests no longer whispered, they simply looked at her with a mix of pity and disdain. Emily had unmasked herself, and the truth was plain for all to see. When the silence had stretched long enough, I stood once more. My knees ached, my back protested, but I felt taller than I had in years. The room was mine again, and every eye returned to me, waiting for what I would say. I spoke not as a man defending himself, but as a father closing a chapter. I told them that love is never measured in ledgers or invoices. It is not a contract to be settled, but a bond that survives precisely because it asks for nothing in return. I explained that Emily's invoice had not humiliated me, but revealed something far deeper, that she no longer understood the essence of love itself. I told them that I had signed her paper because I wanted her to believe she had won. But the truth was that by turning our bond into a transaction, she had already lost something far more precious than money. I looked toward her, not with anger, but with a weary kind of finality. The will, I said, was not written in vengeance, but in clarity. My choice to give the bulk of my estate to a foundation in her mother's name was my way of ensuring that love and sacrifice lived on where they were needed most. I told them that my legacy was not property but principle, not wealth but witness. Then, slowly and deliberately, I signed the final page of the will in front of everyone, as though sealing my life story with one stroke of ink. The sound of the pen scratching across paper filled the room, echoing louder than any words of anger could. When I set the pen down, I knew the moment had passed beyond reversal. The matter was settled. The party had transformed into a testament. The night drew to its end. Guests left quietly, their faces marked by the weight of what they had witnessed. Some clasped my hand with unspoken respect. Others simply nodded, as though acknowledging a truth that had settled deep inside them. My home, once buzzing with celebration, was now steeped in silence. Emily remained seated, her eyes fixed on the floor. Pride still clung to her, but it was cracked, fragile, ready to splinter. I approached her slowly, each step deliberate. My voice was softer than it had been all evening, not triumphant, but resolute. I told her that, despite everything, I had not erased her completely from my will. A portion remained, modest but meaningful, enough to sustain a simple life if she chose humility over entitlement. I explained that this was not a gift of money, but an invitation, one last chance to rediscover what truly mattered. It was not wealth I hoped to leave her, but a lesson. I reminded her that the greatest inheritance any parent can give is not property, but perspective. If she could learn that love is never a transaction, then perhaps there was still hope for her. If not, then the money would vanish quickly, and she would be left to reckon with herself. I ended the evening not with anger, but with a quiet wish that she would one day remember the nights I stayed awake to comfort her. The sacrifices I made, not for recognition, but for love. I wished her the strength to rebuild herself. Not as the woman who handed her father a bill, but as the daughter who could still reclaim her humanity. As I blew out the last candle and the house sank into darkness, I felt a strange peace. My story had been told. My legacy secured. The world might remember me for my will, but I would remember myself for the courage to deliver my final truth. And to those who would one day hear this story, I leave a message: wealth fades, but lessons endure. What we owe to each other cannot be written on paper, it can only be lived. That, in the end, is the true inheritance. The night ended not with applause, but with silence heavy enough to last a lifetime. My daughter walked away with a fragment of inheritance and the full weight of her own choices. I was left with peace, knowing my legacy was safe in hands that understood love, not transactions. What I gave her was not wealth, but a final chance to change. And what I leave behind for those who hear my story is this: we are not measured by the debts others imagine we owe, but by the love we choose to give freely. That is the inheritance no one can take away.